Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I'm Mike Swetnam, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome you this afternoon to a session on Al-Qa'ida, terrorism, the anniversary of 9/11. We've been holding these sessions annually now for 16 years, remembering what happened on this day, a beautiful sunny day in New York and here in Washington, D.C., and in a field in Pennsylvania. And it's been noted by the 9/11 Commission, a couple other congressional reviews, and some private reviews that the event 16 years ago had a lot to do with, as the 9/11 Commission said, a lack of imagination. We couldn't imagine a small group threatening the United States like it did. It was due to a little bit of hubris. We were the last remaining superpower in the world, and we didn't think we could be threatened even by a group that had declared war on us. And if you'll remember back 16 years ago, we were a year, not quite a year, away from an election that was still being argued. That one was about hanging Chad in Florida. Do you remember? A very close presidential election that went to the Supreme Court, and it was still being argued in September, almost a year after the election, whether we had a president we had elected or not. We were consumed with the politics of dissension in Washington. We were hubris about our superpower status in the world, and nobody could threaten us. And we could not imagine a couple dozen people getting together and threatening or harming us the way they did in 9/11. We celebrate, we mourn that day every year here at the Potomac Institute, because if we forget the history from 16 years ago, it's likely to happen again today or in the future. Where are we today? Today, we're almost a year out from an election that's still being argued. We can't imagine that that little country of Korea can harm us. And I don't think, I've heard people say in this room not long ago, that we can't imagine somebody in a garage with a bioengineering capability called CRISPR creating something that could harm the entire human race. So I hope that today we don't commit the same sins we committed 16 years ago by thinking that we can't be harmed, that a small group of people can't hurt us, or that in fact people aren't plotting to do so as we speak here today. Remembering that, it's very important that today we look not just to what's happened in 16 years and what's happening now, but what we can do to make sure that this doesn't happen in the future. Most of you know that at the Potomac Institute we've been dedicated to the study of these things for many, many years, for 20 years now. Yona and I's first book on Al-Qa'ida came out a year before 9/11, and it was a nice profile of a terrorist network that only a few academics paid attention to. A year later, it was one of the most sought-after pieces of information in Washington, D.C. 10 years after that, we put together another volume, a little bit thicker this time, talking about all that had happened since that little terror group managed to threaten and hurt the most powerful country in the world. And most recently, this past year, we actually put together a volume of all the things Osama bin Laden actually wrote and had in his house when he was killed. So it's been documented very well by us and others about how this little group came to terrorize and threaten the largest country in the world. I hope that with your help today, with the scholarship of the people here at this table, that we can address not even so much the history of what happened, but how we prevent it from happening again, and have the imagination to understand that it probably somewhere in the world somebody is plotting to bring about another 9/11 in the very near future. And if it isn't something we're imagining or preparing for, then shame on us. With that, let me introduce Professor Yona Alexander, who you all know, who has been the master of this work for many decades. He's the author of more than 100 books, and we're very proud to have him here at the Potomac Institute leading many of these efforts. Yona, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Mike, for your welcome introduction. And it is, I wouldn't say a pleasure, but an obligation to meet today for several reasons. One, obviously, we have to express our condolences to those who are victimized by Mother Nature terror as we speak in the United States, Caribbean, the latest earthquake in Mexico, and around the world. So obviously we have to deal with terror from above, and tragically we have to deal with man-made terrorism from below, if you will. As Mike indicated, we're going to mark the 16th anniversary of the 9/11, particularly to focus on the impact and the consequences, the lessons, and most importantly, what can we do in order to prevent a future 9/11, not only with so-called primitive or conventional, I think, weapons, but perhaps even the utilization of some sort of weapon of mass destruction. So let me first introduce our distinguished panel and make one or two footnotes and move on. Our first speaker who will provide the context to our discussion is Ambassador Ronald Newman, currently retired, and we had the honor to have him before and to share his views. He currently is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, diplomacy that we need, particularly at this time, to provide more clarity to the policy decisions and so on, and implementation. Formerly, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, Afghanistan. We provided the bios of the speakers. So, the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details to discuss his background, the background of the other speakers, but he served for many years throughout the Middle East and elsewhere. So, I'm sure that to have the ambassador to deal with perhaps some of the aspects of diplomacy and the role of diplomacy to combat terrorism would be extremely useful. Our second speaker is Dr. Wayne Zeidman, former FBI legal attaché in the Middle East and Jordan. He served in Israel, and he covered the whole area of Syria, for example, and Iran. He has also an academic background, a PhD in Farsi and Arabic, Hebrew, and all that. So we cooperated here for many years, and is again someone who can speak from the practical point of view and the role of law enforcement, the intelligence, and so forth. Our third speaker is Dr. Mir Sadat. Currently is a policy strategist at the U.S. Navy, but formerly he was a professor of national security at the National Intelligence University, and he served for many years as an advisor in the intelligence community. And he can provide very unique, I think, insights into the role of intelligence and the regional situations in the Middle East and South and West Asia and so forth. And last, our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, who needs no introduction, is the chairman of the International Law Institute and professor of law at Georgetown University. And he will deal with some of the legal issues related to the 9/11. Fortunately, in the audience, we have representatives from some over a dozen countries who have special interests. They represent different regions around the world, and we're delighted that they came in order to share their views, because no country, including the United States, can deal with the challenges unilaterally, as we know. So that they are welcome, and of course, we welcome our academic colleagues, as well as former and current members of the U.S. Government. And last but not least, our interns and the fellows who joined us. They represent the next generation of experts and scholars. And of course, after our discussion, we are blessed to have, of course, with us today, fortunately, General Al Gray, who doesn't need any introduction, because not only is a great American, but is a very exceptional leader for many, many years. So basically, that's the theme, and I would encourage the discussion. Now, before I do, just one more footnote in terms of the remembrance of the 9/11. We know exactly what took place, despite the conspiracy theories and so forth. And we know that not only the United States was attacked and victimized, but the entire international community. In fact, we do have members here from the countries who were also attacked at the 9/11. On a personal level, if I just may mention specifically three individuals, or two individuals and a group of individuals that I knew. One of them is John O'Neill. For many of you, his name is known, who focused at the FBI for many years on the rise of the Al-Qa'ida. And when he retired, he became the director of that area, the World Trade Center. And tragically, he died when the terrorists struck. And the second one is a individual who is the son of a colleague of mine, General Dov Shafi from Israel, who happened to attend a meeting at the World Trade Center, and he was killed. And then I must mention the group of some of my former students, from New York State who happened to work and be in the building at the time, and obviously they died, and there are memories and memorials on the campuses of the university. Finally, I'd like to mention that today the Al-Qaeda media sources, they issued or released some videos related to the 9/11, trying to glorify the Mujahideen, the attackers, and indicating specifically that they were superior to the superpower, the United States, and they were successful. And they are encouraging other Mujahideens to strike against the United States and their friends and allies. In other words, today, they mark that anniversary in a different direction, which really means, as Mike indicated, that we are not surprised for the activities of the Al-Qaeda because of their imagination, and there is no end to their imagination, as well as to their evil intentions. So we have to be aware of that. And again, once we mention the 9/11, we have to mention specifically the 9/11 attack, the 5th anniversary on the U.S. Diplomats in Benghazi, Ambassador Stevens and his colleagues. And again, I think if we focus only on the Al-Qaeda, we are not going to see the forest, because obviously we have to discuss also other forms of terrorism, theological, for example, the Shiite activity. And in fact, now in September, we mark the 33rd anniversary of the attack by the Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah with the support of Iran on the U.S. Embassy annex in Beirut, killing some 23 people. So with this in mind, we are going to move on to discuss, as I mentioned before, the impact and specifically the lessons and the responses to terrorism in terms of rationale, the cost of terrorism. And I think if you go down the list, you would find at least a dozen different perspectives related to the cost, all the way from the humanitarian aspect to the technological and so forth. And I would like to encourage again the audience to participate and to share their views about this challenge and what can we do about this. Finally, one more thing. The activities that we conduct that Mike mentioned is, again, in cooperation with our colleagues in the United States and abroad. I mentioned already the International Law Institute. I'm delighted that the University of Virginia School of Law is involved in our activities. And we have Professor Bob here, who came to share some of his views on that aspect. So with that, please, Ambassador Newman, would you like to come up here, or
I think I can just
sit there? That's fine.
It's hard
Go
enough
ahead.
to get in and out of these chairs, so I think I'll just stay up.
You all Army guys are all alike. You're just like,
Just like sit down,
that's
right.
all the exercise you're going to get.
We had things to say about the Marines too. However, we worked under Marine control where I was, so I have to be a little different. Well, thank you, Dr. Alexander. Pardon me for the byplay with General Gray. We've known each other for a while and have some long ago backgrounds in common. Dr. Alexander didn't give me too many specific guidelines for what I should say, except he told me not to be longer than 15 minutes at the absolute outside. But he seemed to have some misplaced faith in my willingness to talk about the diplomatic aspect. And I thought I would really try to concentrate on simply a couple of points. And much of this is in the literature, but one is the continuing and probable extended continuing nature of this situation for a very long time to come, which is scarcely new. And the other is what that means for foreign policy, or at least to make some early points about that. We have seen in the last 16 years that not only does Al-Qaeda still exist, as Dr. Alexander was just noting, but that it has spun off a variety of associated movements. The Islamic State was itself generated initially within Al-Qaeda, and then that is those who organized it, and then it's broken away on its own. And the very failure of its excessive territorial options, or what it was trying to achieve, may well encourage a return of many of its survivors to Al-Qaeda, because after all, one of the breaking points was Al-Qaeda's view that it was too early in the Great Jihad to try to move to this form of territorial control. And that was one of the differences with Baghdadi and others. And as you are now getting a conspicuous failure of the Islamic State with its loss of control of territory, which was a key part of the whole rationale of the caliphate, it would not be illogical to assume that that will be seen by some committed people as a reason to go back or to go to Al-Qaeda as having proved that its prescription was correct. In any event, you have seen, we've all seen the morphing and movement of this and related ways of thinking, whether it's Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and various people swearing allegiance with greater or lesser conviction to them. Al-Qaeda is still closely allied with parts of the Taliban, particularly the Haqqani network in eastern Afghanistan. So it's still there. I think one has to pay credit, but I'll leave that for other speakers, to the actual incredible success of military and law enforcement over the last 16 years, that we have not had another incident in the United States. And that's the kind of thing which we really don't pay much attention to because it didn't happen. But probably credit is due, but it's also probably a little excessive to assume that you can perform at 100% always. And that suggests that we will have another problem at some point. You have an ideology which has not run its course. There was an interesting article, op-ed in the USA Today that I happened to see today by Lee Hamilton and was it Keating, the former co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. It was interesting because everything he said in it was pretty much right, but there was almost nothing new to say. We've kind of explored a lot of these. And they come to the policy and they say, we need to refute the ideology. And we need a counter ideology. Well, that's fine. Ideologies tend to be developed by charismatic individuals. We haven't had another one recently. They are, in my experience, not something you can profitably order up from the bureaucracy. And there's something else, which is ideologies have a very long lifespan. I really only know of 3 ways that you get rid of an ideology. One is ethnic cleansing. You can kill everybody who holds the ideology before anybody else gets it. That's unlikely to be our pursued policy. You can find that there is another ideology which supersedes it, which somehow produces tremendous conversions. Nice if you can get it, unlikely to be something we can control or make happen. And the third way ideologies disappear is when they are seen over a period of time by a great many of their adherents to fail. And that leads to people looking for another solution. Doesn't tell you where that solution will be found and whether it will be, from our point of view, better or worse. But after all, this is effectively what happened to communism. It was not that we won ideologically, that people decided our way was better nearly so much as their way conspicuously failed. And it failed over a long enough period of time for people to notice that. That's interesting because that took 7 decades. And there is nothing which indicates now that the radical Islamism which gives rise to Al-Qaeda and related movements is going to go away in any faster period. Might be. I don't have a crystal ball. But there's nothing which tells you that's likely to happen. So we're going to be dealing with this for a long time. This is profoundly unsettling to Americans because we have for half a century, a little better now, been locked into a kind of unexamined paradigm of war. For us, war is short. It is something that requires the huge national commitment, and it ends in victory. Now we have something which is long, which is not involving the majority of Americans most of the time, and which is unlikely to end in a clear-cut victory anytime soon. That is profoundly unnerving. It's also something which politicians simply find it excruciatingly difficult to talk about. Because everybody wants to know, how do you win? What's the end game? What's the solution? And if what you have to do to explain your policies is to start off by saying, we don't have a solution. We're just going to work through this with the best bits and pieces of solutions we can get, that's really not a very sellable message. It's a message that you can deal with intellectuals in seminars. It plays very badly when you have to try to make that message a counterpoint to simplistic black and white, let's win today, here's how we win. So your starting policy problem is that it is very difficult to explain to the public at large or congressional testimony in a way that is very satisfactory the starting position for your policy. Because you don't want to say that we can't win this today or tomorrow or next week or next year or in this presidential term or who knows, maybe in this century. I hope shorter, but we don't know. That's the first starting point. Second one is perhaps to remember, as you think about how ideologies live and die and how this ideology has come about, that one reason it is so strong, in my opinion, we're about opinions today, in the Middle East is because of the failure of previous conflicting ideologies. And so you had in the post-colonial period, you had Arab nationalism, conspicuous failure. Didn't bring about development, didn't bring about involvement. You've had various uses and misuses of democracy, and frankly, they have not paid off for various reasons. One can argue in general that they haven't been tried in much of the Arab world, that what you have had is sort of fake efforts. In any event, when and where it has been tried, it has not done very well against ethnic forces. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that, and it's very complex. But the fact is, that the promise of democracy is very broadly seen by people, especially in extremist camps, to be a failure. And that's before you get to the ideological rejection of democracy as an alternative to Islamic law for who should govern. So you have authoritarianism, which was sort of mixed with anti-Israeli professions. You have sort of democracy. You have Arab socialism. They're all gone. They're all essentially seen as failures. So there is, in much of the Middle East, very little standing on the ideological ground to combat these motions. There's a dislike of them. The vast majority of Muslims are not terrorists, extremists, etc. That's still, but when you have as many billions as you do, even a small percentage is still a lot of people. But you have, one of the strengths of this movement is the absence of demonstrated alternatives. And the third thing I would look at in forming policies is that you have you have a lot of national references where this movement grows across national lines but isn't always transnational. So that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is not terribly closely related to Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They're pieces. What does that tell you for policy? First of all, it tells you that you probably have no end game that you can define and that you can build backwards in a logical, single planning process for a total policy. You can deal with individual factors, and you're probably going to have to deal with individual countries or subsets. But it's time to stop chasing the mirage of a single policy which is going to fix all this. Where there are things that are positive, we need to grab hold of them. There aren't too many, but one that we have is Tunisia, where you've had the overthrow of an autocratic regime, an amazing amount of self-restraint on the part of Islamic movements that were actually a majority in the democratically elected government. And so far so good. I worked a little on Tunisia, and I try to explain, how do you explain Tunisia? And it's sort of like somebody walking a tightrope between two very high skyscrapers. So far it's so good, but you don't have a lot of room for a misstep. But Tunisia is one of the few places where you have a living Arab example of an alternative, and if it works, that's something to pay attention to. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to try to go country by country. I will say that I think we are going, because we are going to be at this long term, and because people do still mean us harm, we are going to still have to have military and intelligence components of this, which will remain strong. We're not going to be able to say drone strikes yes or drone strikes no, or special ops yes or special ops no, and treat these in black and white ways. We are going to have to repeatedly consider how much gain, how much loss, who's alienated, how much we're building other people in, and then how these things fit into broader strategies. We're not talking about that, so that we need to think about a broader Iraq strategy, which we sort of talk about, but we haven't quite figured out how to integrate a military piece of that. We have never had a Syrian strategy since the beginning of the outbreak of demonstrations. We don't have one now, and I have no idea whether we will get one. We have a military strategy for crushing the manifestation of the Islamic State, after which I have absolutely no idea. As far as I can tell, neither does the administration. you can go on like we're going to have to think about these, but we're going to have to think about them in terms of countries. Then how does that relate to the country next door, but not necessarily how do you make a regional strategy out of it. We will probably have to take in some contradictions, and in some cases we will have to think about some really ugly trade-offs. Do you go for stability in a given place and support somewhat nasty people, but recognize that when that system breaks down, you may have more trouble in the long run? Or do you not? And do you accept much more chaos? Do you insist on territorial integrity or not? There are a lot of these fundamental questions which probably can't be answered yes, no, black, white, but which are going to have to be dealt with in the case of individual countries. Is territorial integrity really important in Libya? Why? Is it important in Iraq? Why? And sometimes the answer may be because when you mess with it, it's worse. It's not a rhetorical way of saying it's not important, but I'm saying that there's some very basic questions out here which we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to deal with them often in a country basis, and we're going to have to deal with them for a long time, and then we're going to have to figure out what execution means, because just having policies won't be enough. And having now posed any number of unanswered questions, my time is up, and I can turn to others to solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wayne?
In the gray, I'm gonna stand like the Marines.
That's, okay, good. Ron.
My discussion's gonna hit on several topics. The first one is Al-Qaeda's death announcement was premature. I'm gonna discuss some of the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. I'm gonna talk about bad U.S. policies, because we can't forget that, on how policies contribute to the problems we have. Why Islamic extremism is so dangerous to the West, and what should the FBI do to improve its capabilities. First of all, let's start with prior to 9/11. Osama bin Laden miscalculated on what the U.S. Response would be. He thought the U.S. was an empty suit, a paper tiger. And he came to those conclusions because he remembered the East Africa bombings, the Black Hawk Down episode in Somalia, and the USS Cole attack. And he remembers President Clinton's very, very weak responses to these attacks. A couple of missiles fired into the desert at a cement factory. So he miscalculated the result of what he was going to do and what the result would be. Since 9/11, we've had the U.S. Special Operations, the drone strikes, the killing of Osama bin Laden, and many in the intelligence community believed Al-Qaeda was on its deathbed. But while we hit the organization in Afghanistan and Pakistan, new Al-Qaeda affiliates grew stronger. Al-Qaeda has developed affiliates. They've developed franchises, so to speak, in several Muslim countries where they spread their ideology, their fighters, and furnished assistance. After the chaos that was created by the Arab Spring, Al-Qaeda joined insurgencies that control territory across North Africa and the Middle East. And one example is veteran jihadis relocating to Libya, where they took advantage of the uprising against Gaddafi. And one thing we should recall about that is that it was a mistake to decide to overthrow the Gaddafi regime and to allow him to be killed. This was after Gaddafi decided to align himself with the West and agreed to disarm and dismantle his nuclear program. Does this make any sense? This is at the same time that we were trying to convince Iran to disarm and dismantle their own nuclear weapons program. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Musab al-Zakari, broke off from Al-Qaeda, as the ambassador mentioned, and he became the eventual founder of ISIS. ISIS broke away with Al-Qaeda in Iraq to form its own group with a Salafi jihadist religious and political ideology with origins in Saudi Wahhabism. Its leader was al-Baghdadi. Now, some of the affiliates, or the branches of al-Qaeda. Somalia's al-Shabaab, which spread into Uganda and Kenya. Boko Haram in Nigeria, spread throughout much of northeastern Nigeria, Cameroon, and Niger. Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which later had a name change to Jabhat Fath al-Sham by its leader Muhammad al-Julani. Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, with primarily activity in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda roles included providing guidance and assistance to its affiliates and planning operations outside the Middle East, such as the murders in and around the Paris offices of Charlie Hebdo and the grocery store. All of these affiliates have ties to Zawahiri from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb continues to operate in the West and North Africa. And that gets us to our second point. Unfortunately, the United States government has set forth bad strategies to fight terrorism. The U.S., along with Saudi and Pakistani intelligence, supported the Mujahideen when they were fighting the former Soviet Union in Afghanistan. I know why they did it. They wanted to attack the Soviet Union, but they didn't consider unintended consequences. What they did by supporting the Mujahideen was to support Osama bin Laden and his network, and they eventually, after they defeated the Soviets, and the Soviets left, they turned their guns on the West and the United States. So, in my opinion, it's something that we have to consider when we're making policy. President Carter's Iran policy saw the emergence of the Ayatollah Khomeini. He thought a holy man and an Islamic regime would be a bulwark against communism. President Clinton let a number of attacks against us go largely unanswered, and the United States became the Rodney Dangerfield, no respect. After 9/11, the U.S. government defined our enemy as Islamic extremism. During the last 8 years, however, the Obama administration refused to mention the words Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism. Obama decided to allow Iran to become a nuclear state. The Iran agreement says that 8 years from now, Iran can legitimately become a nuclear state. So Obama's idea was that they would become a nuclear state, that we're going to live with them in that capacity, and that they would help govern parts of the Middle East. We supported Shia leadership in Iraq, which allowed Iran to gain influence in Iraq. Instead of supporting our Middle East allies like Gaddafi, Mubarak, etc., we decided to promote the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2009, in a speech that was given in Cairo, it was insisted that the Muslim Brotherhood have presence in the front row. In the Middle East, that has a lot of significance, who you invite and the position you put them in. Obama invited the Muslim Brotherhood into Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, etc. He decided that the Muslim Brotherhood could be a partner for peace, that it could play a democratic role. In point of fact, their ideology is totally incompatible with U.S. policy. And he thought that they would play a part in the governing of the countries when they themselves wanted to take over those countries. Now let's go to look at the FBI policy pre-9/11. The FBI slogan was, "It blows up, we show up." By that I mean that investigations were totally reactive. A crime occurs, a terrorist incident occurs, and then the FBI works for years developing evidence, presenting prosecutive summary reports to the U.S. attorney. The case will then be brought to court, and they may or not ever locate the perpetrators. If they do, they will bring them to U.S. District Court. There may then be problems to whether there is adequate evidence beyond reasonable doubt. There may also be problems presenting evidence due to sources and methods. For example, if the FBI is working with the CIA, military intelligence, NSA, or other intelligence agencies, much of the information is provided for intelligence purposes only. The intelligence agencies do not want to end up testifying in court. They do not want to destroy their confidential sources, so they will not want to furnish the evidence to be used in a criminal prosecution. After 9/11, there was a huge culture change within the FBI, and we began treating such investigations as intelligence investigations. This new policy plans to disrupt and defeat terrorism before it occurs, to be proactive, to prevent terrorist actions from occurring in the U.S. And Ambassador Newman mentioned that unfortunately we can't stop all terrorist incidents from occurring. I like the analogy of it's like a hockey game. There's maybe hundreds of shots on the goal, and they're stopped. But eventually one shot is going to get through. And that's, unfortunately, you get rewarded for all the good things that happen, but you don't get rewarded for the good things that happen, but when something bad happens, you get the blame for it. As a legal attaché for the FBI working overseas, I met with intelligence agencies, security agencies, and police agencies from the host countries. And in many cases, they cooperate with us. But they also have told me in most cases that the information is not for law enforcement purposes. It is for intelligence purposes only. They have a right to restrict its use. If they are giving us information, they can limit how it is used. It does not lend itself well for law enforcement purposes. Now, when the Obama administration took over, one of their goals was to close Gitmo down and to release all the prisoners. In my opinion, this was a policy that was doomed to failure because they are not criminals, they're enemy combatants. It would be a grave mistake to bring detainees to the United States and put them on trial in a civilian court. If the evidence is not strong enough, or due to sources and methods, evidence is withheld, the person may be acquitted. If that happens, they go free. One of the reasons for Gitmo is that the home countries of these enemy combatants do not want them back. They've developed a lot of battlefield experience on smuggling, experience on forged documents, experience in weapons, and they don't want them back in their countries. And they also pose a threat to the United States. Now, the next topic is why it's important to consider Islamic extremism to be an existential threat. We are making a mistake in assuming that we should focus on a specific target like Al-Qa'ida or ISIS. The enemy is a global network of jihadi groups. They are all working on the same religious ideology, that there must be an Islamic state, a caliphate. The only legislation should be Sharia, Islamic law. Self-sacrifice, martyrdom, is a sacred act, a religious expression. Religious leaders speak on behalf of God, and they know what God wants them to do, and there's no need to minimize violence. Islamic extremists have no desire to limit civilian casualties. For Islamic extremists, their audience is not the international community. In the early days of terrorism, when they were leftist groups, they wanted to gain sympathy for their cause. But with Islamic extremism, their audience is God, and they presume to know what he wants them to do, and terrorism is a sacred act to them. Now, besides, when you talk about the origins of terrorism, besides talking about the Mujahideen, which in Afghanistan, Khomeini's ideology in Iran became the model for all religiously motivated terrorism that followed. He wanted to eliminate the superpowers and make them the predominant religion, ideology, and political system in the whole world. As a result of his example, we now have groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qa'ida, and its affiliates, ISIS, etc. Iran is the #1 sponsor of terrorism worldwide, and they are responsible for destabilizing much of the Middle East. The left in the world, and left in this country, many of them are sympathetic to Islamic extremists. And the question is why? When you look at Khomeini's export version of the Islamic Revolution, it states that the West, Mustakbarin, which is oppressors, it exploits all oppressed people. The Mustazafin, the oppressed, wretched people, the goal is to mobilize the revolutionary fervor of the masses to overthrow existing governments and to establish Islamic governments. This is Salah Alinsky 101. Also, the basic idea is that the United States started as a corrupt country, that we were a slave-holding country, and since then we've continued to be corrupt, and that everything bad that happens in the world is as a result of the United States policies. So So the left has taken Islamic extremism under its wing, so to speak. Dar al-Islam is the abode of Islam, which is peace. Dar al-Harb is the abode of war. In the Islamic extremism books, all lands that are within the abode of Islam are all lands that are not within the abode of Islam are within the abode of war. This must continue until all the people either convert to Islam or are willing to be ruled by Islam under Islamic law. Islamic extremists take Jews and Christians out of the previously protected category of people of the book by declaring them to no longer be monotheists. They call them mushrikeen, and this makes them fair game. We now see in the Middle East a systematic genocide against Christians taking place. And of course, we know that they're against Jews, whether Israelis or outside of Israel. They have an unwillingness to negotiate or compromise. A good example of that is the Hamas manifesto, where they say that all Islamic land is part of the Islamic Waqf, and that any attempt to negotiate or compromise even 1 inch of that land would subject you to the title of infidel, and you're punishable by death. Throughout the world, Islamic extremism has been exported via the thousands of mosques funded by Saudi Arabia and Iran. The imams placed in these mosques and Islamic education centers represent either the Wahhabi clergy in Saudi Arabia or the Ayatollah in Iran. The result has been that the radicalization of much of mainstream Islam. Now, what should the FBI be doing to improve our response to terrorism? Well, it doesn't hurt for the FBI to conduct community relations with leaders in the U.S. Islamic community. It is not effective to rely only on community contacts with the imams and mosque leaders. In many cases, they should be our targets. They're just playing us. We also can't rely or work with organizations like CAIR, C-A-I-R, or the Muslim Students Association, etc. These are front organizations for terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, etc. And they certainly shouldn't be involved in training or advising FBI personnel. We must rely less on technical coverage and more on human intelligence. Special agents need more training in the academies or outside the academy in critical languages and cultural studies of the Near East and North Africa. This should help in recruiting more classified sources within the Islamic community, and the FBI should make more use of undercover operations by agents and sources. Thank you.
I need to run. See Libya Kelly. Very good. See Libya Kelly.
Our CEO is pulling his usual escape, dumping it all on me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you much for coming. I appreciate you.
Distinguished audience, fellow panelists, some of whom I've known for a long time, to include Ambassador Newman, and whose father my parents knew for a long time in Afghanistan. So let me give you the straight disclaimer for every government employee. I'm sure the general knows this better by heart than anybody. I don't represent the United States Navy, the government, or any of its agencies, departments, but I'm sure I can speak for a lot of sailors and a lot of colleagues of mine who have the same opinions of my own.
You can represent me, it's okay.
Anytime, sir. I was looking at your bio, sir. I don't know how you did that in one lifetime. Many Marines and sailors can't do that in 5 lifetimes, sir. So if you think I'm coming here to give you a solution, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm currently on the CNO's space team, and we can't even solve space properly, or I can't solve space properly. I've actually got some criticism. I recently wrote a paper saying we will never win in space, and so I got a lot of hate email, and a lot of Trekkies are trolling me now, and so I got a lot of other issues to deal with besides my terrorism opinions. But like every good sailor, I'm going to tell you a great story. It's going to make you feel good. It's going to make you feel sad, and hopefully it'll leave you with some ideas on how we can approach this topic more progressively. So there I was today walking into the Pentagon, parked across the street because we had a memorial today. Didn't know the president was there. And so a lot of traffic coming in. And I was walking in around the same time as the plane hit the Pentagon, right? And I usually use that same entrance every day, that perimeter entrance. And I was thinking about, what do these people that day, a lot of Navy colleagues of mine, intel officers were there. I mean, think about it. That day we had a daycare at the Pentagon. So many things that could have gone even worse, right? I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about 16 years ago, living in San Diego, finishing my PhD, driving to work. I don't know what time it was, sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, West Coast time. And I look out, I'm at Scripps Ranch, right outside of Miramar, and I look out, and all I see in vehicles are a bunch of Marines dressed, and it's dark. And I'm going, what is going on? Is China invading us? I turn on the radio, and it's like an Orwellian story. First tower's been hit. We don't know if it's an accident or not. And I'm like, by the time I get to downtown San Diego and all my colleagues there, and this company that we actually service these airlines, and we sort of do their tune-ups. And of course, we're typing in the numbers of these aircraft to see, is this a malfunction? Nope, this is a good-to-go aircraft. All things were checked. Everything's good to go. And then you see the people jumping from the buildings, right? And of course, the internet, my company, goes dead. And then this follows, though, an interesting story, because 2 days before, at my house, my family happens to be of Afghan heritage, another interesting story was taking place. The last resistance to the Taliban, Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, was killed. So, of course, my parents, being American citizens, very proud, still have an interest in that part of the world, said, there goes Afghanistan. It is now rife for Taliban and Al-Qa'ida exploitation. And so 2 days later, forward that to that event, and then by the time I get to work, there's speculations. In my heart, I knew it was Al-Qa'ida, just because I had studied this problem set for a long time before. At work, the reactions of colleagues who, until the couple days before, to them, I was just another kid from San Diego, and then them realizing where I'm from, and the questions, where's Osama bin Laden? I wish I could tell you where he is, because I'd be $25 million richer, and we could get the son of a gun, right? So think about that story, the evolution of that, and then think about the 16-year-old kid that's born on September 11th, or right around there today, in high school, and how this has impacted not just one generation, but a couple of generations, and how this is changing the rules of the game for us, thought process-wise, policy, government. I mean, think about 100 years ago, 100 years ago today, when we were having elections, right? The United States was patiently observing global events from our safe borders, right? Protected by large, vast oceans on both sides, east and west, friendly neighbors on the north and south. And our president then was Woodrow Wilson, and his popular slogan was, he kept us out of war, right? The First World War. As the decades progressed, we could no longer afford that luxury of staying out of these conflicts. We didn't stay a spectator, but we became a global leader. And our role, and we have colleagues here who have lived that in yourselves, we became a global power, and our nation and our leaders and our allies came to expect our full engagement in global contests, right? Recently even affirmed by President Trump and the South Asia security policy strategy. And in today's political climate, you have heard experts talk about how different today is than 100 years ago, how we cannot wait for the news cycle, that the news cycle drives everything. So it's interesting when you think about the history of warfare and how that's changed as well, right? Because before, it was all about how we organize. Today, we can't have that luxury. We studied the adversary, we prepared for it, we trained for it, but we never went to conflict, because that sort of deterrence kept us at bay. Today, that seems like that's being questioned too by the actions of a hostile North Korea. So we were spoiled by the Cold War in that era, where two global powers could go. I mean, we were at edge on every conflict in the world. We were on edges, but we never went to war. Today, even that can be considered moot point. So the shortcomings of playing keep away with one another and the recent start of the global war on terrorism, GWAT, as it's known short, has given rise to all kinds of other issues that we don't think about. War is no longer on land, right? We talked about space, air, sea, cyber, and it's hybrid. Al-Qa'ida has a cyber unit, right? And so does Daesh. We can just imagine what would happen if they ever develop an air component, or if they would ever be able to hijack or intervene via cyber with one of our satellites, commercial or military. This is just the thought out there for you. So we face all of this while we consider an array of threats from state actors, rogue, hostile, maybe they're non-compliant, non-state actors, fractured states like Syria, and emerging proto-states. You know, this is something that I never thought I would use in political science, more maybe archaeology to describe the dinosaurs. But proto-states like ISIS, they do the services of a state, but they're not quite a state yet. Addressing these challenges requires new ways of thinking. We need to break out of our old, forget about the Cold War, we need to break out of the old traditional counterterrorism mindset. And we need to break out of this idea that we were facing 9/11 for such a long time, the Al-Qaeda terrorists. Today, we don't face one Al-Qaeda. Like it was mentioned, there are multiple groups with multiple interests, priorities, tactics, and practices. And that all requires a diversification on our part of dealing with them. 2 years ago, we met at the National Press Club. And one of my other mentors, General Vincent Stewart, spoke about the global environment. And he mentioned that terrorism is even in South Asia. And one of the audience members said, "It's not in my country." And I think it was a matter of 2 weeks that an attack took place in that nation's capital. So ISIS is everywhere. ISIS, I like to describe it, is no longer a franchise. Al-Qaeda is no longer a franchise. They're not even a mom and pop shop. They're like those street vendors you see when you go on vacation that sell trinkets or hot dogs. They're like those guys. And those are the so-called lone wolf actors. They're coordinated and mentored, maybe not directly by somebody with command and control, but they receive guidance and they act on that. So how do we get here? And it was, I think, mentioned, and I'm not going to go much into it, but when George W. Bush came into office, he promised a modest foreign policy and assertive agenda when it regards to the Middle East and South Asia. However, the events of September 11th completely derailed that agenda and quite honestly even reversed it. So the idea was to transform the Middle East, and for that matter, maybe even Afghanistan and South Asia to a certain extent. Major repercussions resulted in the regions because on affecting broader U.S. foreign policy, our bureaucracy, as it was mentioned, was challenged. Our conventional wisdom was challenged. And it was obvious that we were not prepared for this challenge. We were not adequately prepared. You can't ask someone to fight a war they've never prepared for. So these initiatives failed to accomplish their avowed goals, for whatever reason. When Barack H. Obama came to office, he was determined to scale back overseas American military engagements, especially the Middle East. He was skeptical of the U.S. ability to resolve conflicts, especially the Middle East. He attempted what they call a right-sizing of overseas presence, triggering uncertainty across the region with allies. I was there in Afghanistan when the troop drawdown started in Afghanistan, and it caused immense uncertainty for the Afghans. So that's something that also needs to be acknowledged. Limited aerial attacks, drone attacks were launched against enemies in Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. However, this whack-a-mole approach intensified the movements that now are being famously described as the radical Islamic terrorists. Because jihadi terrorists, both radicalized Sunni and Shia terrorists, are implicably waging a holy war, like was mentioned, to advance their Islamist agendas, coupled with a lot of socioeconomic and socio-political grievances that they harness. President Donald J. Trump succeeded 2 consecutive presidents coming into office vowing dramatic changes to American foreign policy, especially the Middle East and Afghanistan. His predecessor's inability to resolve or break out of the cyclical devil spiral from military entanglements is reminiscent to our nation's involvement in Vietnam. And I'm not an expert on Vietnam, but I'm just speaking on what I read. An era when each successful president's campaign vowed to pull out our troops and seek resolution to the conflict. However, the reality of Vietnam was increased involvement and chaos until U.S. engagement was no longer sustainable because we had lost tremendous amount of our sons' blood and finite resources. So we've heard that the military cannot succeed, or military engagements cannot succeed without diplomacy, and there are some who argue the inverse. But what is interesting is that neither is possible without information, right? That is the big I in DIME, or national instruments of power. Jihadi terrorism is more than an intelligence or and law enforcement issue and must be countered through the informational sphere and also other domains. In U.S. strategic communications, it is important to distinguish between moderate Muslims and radical jihadists. We face a complex security environment marked by a broad spectrum of disparate threats, from aggressive non-state nation states to adaptive non-state actors such as Al-Qa'ida, ISIS, Boko Haram, and also their Shia rivals in the Levant. While Daesh might be on the forefront of our thoughts today, they are not the only nefarious organization in town, as was explained. Al-Qaeda is making a comeback. Stay tuned for more. They want something catastrophic because that is how they market themselves. That is how they recruit. Increased international focus on Daesh allows Al-Qaeda to recover from its degraded state, and it enables similar groups to flourish. Furthermore, the jury's still out on the largest sponsor of terrorism, the country that had killed the most number of U.S. people before 9/11, Iran and its affiliates. We do not know yet if Iran will behave responsibly or whether it will invest its 50 to 100 billion US dollars wisely. Let's not forget that Iran has been listed as a sponsor of terrorism until 9/11. It had killed most Americans than any terrorist organization. We must remain vigilant in our defense of our homeland, because some of these actors will continue, either directly or through proxy, to harm our citizens at home and abroad, as they have also killed moderate and progressive Muslims in Muslim countries. While Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and other jihadist groups do not represent the entire population of the Muslim world, they do represent a strong segment and with lethal reach into the West and into other civil societies. In this setting, these groups seek not only to pit the West against Islam, but to stoke sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shias, not so different from the violence of Shia jihadists such as Hezbollah. These groups seek to create a chaotic environment in which the groups can thrive in countries which face simultaneously internal and external threats from terrorism, subnational armed groups, insurgencies, and conventional military threats. So I've deleted some of my portions because some of them were covered. Let me sort of get to the meat of some of these pieces that I want to address. This gloomy environment will not be changing anytime soon. However, terrorism will never bring us to our knees in the near term or the midterm. Still, we can't take our eyes off of these and other unmentioned issues, be they small, medium, or intermediate ones, because left unopposed, they could evolve into strategic challenges. So, While there exists a national counterterrorism center that integrates law enforcement and intelligence community, the government, our government, the United States government, does not have the mechanism in place to engage with foreign populations as we did a century ago. What is needed is a robust U.S. interagency strategic communications organization with members beyond the usual suspect to counter jihadi terrorism. And let me end with a personal reflection. If I haven't put you to sleep yet, you might remember that I started my remarks with a reference to President Wilson. Neither he nor his contemporaries would have guessed where we'd be today. Just as 40 years ago, my parents would have never imagined fleeing Afghanistan as a result of the Soviet Union's invasion and later rise of Islamic extremism in Afghanistan. My children are born on the two great coasts of this nation, with more freedoms, more opportunities, and more chances in life than anywhere on this earth. America may be an imperfect nation, but it is still the greatest nation on this planet. I'm proud and grateful that my family is forever part of this nation's fabric. To put in context, everybody wants to come to the U.S. They do, because we are exceptional. While this is a great testament to our tolerant and democratic society, this open flow of persons, goods, and services and ideas also poses an immense danger to our people and our national security. We must remain vigilant in our defense of the homeland, because violent jihadist actors will continue their efforts, as was mentioned, either directly or through proxy, to harm our nations at home and abroad, as they kill moderates and progressives, even in their own countries. The challenge is discerning between those who are peaceful and law-abiding from those who mean us harm. The challenge is doing this without losing our exceptional values. So with that, let me end my remarks and field any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Don Wallace?
It's always the case, forgive me, a little bit hoarse. As is always the case with Yona's panels, they're very rich, and there's no exception. And in some sense, there's too much in them because everything is covered. And the question is, how do you pull it together? And I don't, for one, really know. I'm a lawyer, and Yona always wants me to say something about the law. I will not, because we're talking about strategy, except, you know, some years ago, after 9/11, the issue became, could we both preserve our security? And the ambassador has pointed out we've been pretty successful at home, and our liberties, and I think the courts remain very strong, as I think our president is discovering. So my guess is we've kept that balance in rather good shape. I agree completely with Wayne. I don't think we have to mince words. I mean, the problem in these countries we've talked about is radical Islamic terrorism. It is a holy war, not for all Muslims by any chance. I've lived in the Middle East and lived in Turkey, travel a lot in the rest of the Middle East. Most Muslims are perfectly normal people. Anyone's normal. But we're talking about a certain group, and they are inspired by a religious fervor. It's, in a way, the ambassador used the word ideology. It's in something, it's maybe even more than an ideology. It is a kind of a faith for some of these people, and unquestionably, it has to be coped with. You know, we've talked about strategy, and of course we think of looking outward, but I think a real issue is strategy for ourselves. You know, what do we do? And recognizing the problem, and I think we pretty much do. I don't think we're in denial. How do you cope with it? That's life, right? You have problems. My left knee hurts, you know, from tennis. What do? Do I give up tennis or soldier on and injure it again? So the question is really a question for us. And I think it was Mike who used the word hubris. Americans certainly, we are exceptional. We tend to exaggerate, let's put it that way. It's our great strength. I hope we don't go in the other direction, that we go from doing too much to doing too little. And right now you hear many people saying we can't convert the world to democracy. And I think that's true. We cannot convert it. But I don't think we should abandon the cause. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a fellow who was over the top. But as even Henry Kissinger, who has great fun sort of attacking Wilson, I thought that when Princeton contemplated the possibility of changing the name of its school, Henry Kissinger would have been happy. But I think it is part of America, this drive we have, maybe not to save the world, but to have an influence on it. And I hope we won't give up. For one thing, if we abandon our faith, the Chinese are here to push their faith, which may not be a holy war, but it might be quite a serious one. So the question really is, what do? We can't do everything. We must establish priorities. We don't have resources for everything. Yona always begins these programs by reminding us about natural catastrophes and man-made catastrophes. And we've seen a lot of natural catastrophes. I expect we can cope to the extent you can cope with these damn things. My wife is a very devout Catholic and always worships Mother Nature, which I'm not sure Catholics are supposed to do. But Mother Nature is pretty damn impressive. But we have these priorities. I mean, we have these tremendous challenges. We have the natural ones. We have the challenge of keeping the 7th Fleet up to date, General Gray. We've heard so much about the other forms of terrorism, biochemical, etc. And we've heard that there's some, that, as Ambassador Newman said, this clearly goes way beyond just, knocking out Raqqa. It's a question of what, and it is long term. It may be permanent, because to the extent I lived in the Middle East, and it's reasonably clear to me that for whatever reason, God has created a group of countries which have a lot of difficulty coping in the modern world, and they're going to have that difficulty probably forever. And therefore, something like what we see today with this radical Islamic, something like that will exist. And so I think for us, the challenge, I think our strategy has to be how to sort out the priorities for ourselves. America's also, we can do everything, and I, of that faith, I've also America should be number one. I don't have doubts about America. I don't blame America. In fact, I get very annoyed with people who do blame America. But it's one thing to not blame it, but it's another thing to be realistic about our abilities. And it's very difficult for us, given our history, which is basically to take it on. It's like the General Grant, just throw enough soldiers in there and you win the battle. And it really has been our approach. Throw enough in there and you win. And it's tricky, and it really means we have to, in some sense, continue to grow up. And one thing I might say as a lawyer, I don't talk to law. Lawyers do believe in facts. Many people are skeptical about that, but I think we do believe that the adversary process produces, if not truth, it sharpens the facts. And I would definitely say that one thing we must be is analytic. We have got to be analytic as hell in distinguishing things, always putting it in the perspective that after all the analysis done, that doesn't solve the problem of what you do with the facts, but we certainly should not abandon facts. And so intelligence is crucial, just gathering it. And again, and we should come back to more of these programs that Yona puts together for us. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Don and the other panelists. As moderator, I'm going to take the liberty to open the discussion and dialogue, and then, of course, the panelists can jump in any time. First, I would like to call on our colleague, Professor Bob Turner from the University of Virginia, to make some comments, particularly because Vietnam was mentioned, and since you served in Vietnam and you're teaching national security law, if you can share some of your views for a few minutes. You can use the mic.
Mic goes.
This one, okay.
I don't have a few minutes worth, and I'm gonna pass on Vietnam just because it can't be done in a few minutes. I'll pick up on something else. I thought this was a superb program, the best program I've been to in several years. I was very impressed with all the speakers. And I'm glad I wasn't. You had originally invited me to be on it, and I missed your email. And I looked at your program, and I said, "You don't have room for another speaker." I'm going to try not to let that happen now. I thought particularly Dr. Zeidman's comments were very good, and I want my old friend Don Wallace over there. I want to bring him into a legal question based upon Wayne's comment. Well, Wayne said we should not allow the terrorist detainees in Guantanamo to be brought in this country and tried in domestic courts. And it's something I've long supported, being a strong believer in the rule of law. There is a very strong body of international law, starting off with the 1949 Geneva Convention. It's actually not starting with that. It goes back to the Hague Conventions and Kellogg-Briand and so forth. But one of my concerns, people say, well, military tribunals aren't fair. Well, first of all, every member of the U.S. military is subject to military tribunals for any wrongful act. Our court martials are military tribunals. But more importantly, when we say we are going to give the detainees greater protections by bringing them into our courts, what we're really saying is, rather than applying the international standards that have been developed through treaties over the centuries, we're going to apply domestic law standards, national standards to POWs or detainees. Maybe they don't qualify as real POWs, but they are detainees in an armed conflict. And it strikes me, if that's our principle, and under the doctrine of reciprocity, any other country can apply our interpretation of the law if they get into a quarrel with us, what we're really saying is that it was perfectly all right for the Japanese and the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese to abuse the hell out of American POWs because that's national treatment. That's what their domestic law allows. And so it really frightens me that, for the best of reasons, thinking we're going to make sure these people are fairly treated, which is an American tradition that I admire, we are really undermining international law by saying that domestic treatment instead of international standards is the proper way of dealing with detainees in armed conflict. And Don, let me get you to hit that one first, and then everybody else wants to pick up. But again, fantastic program. Really enjoyed it.
I think I said before that I don't know much. I'm ignorant, and I certainly got to say that to
Tom,
Turner.
Can you speak a little bit louder so they can hear in the back?
Can you hear me, Sharon? Good. Sorry, I have a hoarse throat. I think I said at the beginning, or I should have, that I consider myself very ignorant about most things, and certainly questions put by Bob, who I have known for a long time. Well, I'm not an expert on that subject, but I don't think the intention would be to abandon international law. I think there are two issues. One is the appearance. Some people think that Guantanamo is such an exceptional thing, and it is in a way, of course. The other thing is that the ordinary U.S. federal courts have convicted any number of terrorists, I think, in every case. And of course you'd be applying international law. I mean, I agree completely. If you wouldn't apply the law of Queens or Brooklyn, to these guys. So I think it could be done. It's funny, I do a seminar which meets this evening on the constitutional aspects of foreign affairs, separation of powers, and students like to write about Gitmo. And could the president on his own basically send these people to domestic courts, or could he send them to foreign countries? I'm on a committee where Ambassador Pickering, and Ambassador Jones said yes, and everyone else said no. But it is a practical problem because these poor government officials who would be signing off on the chits to get him into the local courts would have problems. I certainly would never abandon for 1 minute the Geneva Convention or the law of war or anything, and nor would we. I mean, as you know from many cases, Paqueta Habana being the most famous, that international law applies in our courts unless it's varied. Or no, I think it's more a question of appearance. And by the way, I think quite frankly, I'm a civilian. My father was a soldier. I think the civilian courts in many ways would function more quickly. These military commissions have had a lot of problem for one reason or another, partly the active defense provided by the JAG officers who defend these people. So but I couldn't agree more. I wouldn't apply some local law. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Ambassador?
Oh, we have to let.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that I was looking at it from a pragmatic standpoint, that they are given the enemy combatants are given due process overseas. The problem with bringing them to U.S. court systems is that in many cases, the evidence that they have against them is such that it can never see the light of day in federal court.
That's true in the commission.
And like I mentioned, as a legal attaché, a lot of the information we get from our foreign partners is given with the strict proviso that it never be used in a criminal proceeding. And the same thing with our own intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA. If we cannot use that evidence and we bring them to the United States, there's a good chance that most of them are going to be acquitted. And if that's the case, they're released. It's just a pragmatic problem.
Well, I agree with that. I mean,
Ambassador?
But that evidence would not be admissible in the military commissions either. There may be some. I have no objection to detaining people forever in some cases,
It's
at
an
least
ongoing war.
until the war against terrorism ends, which will be never. Which will be never.
Right.
So that's not. I don't dispute that for a minute. But for those that you are trying because you believe you can convict, I don't see a major problem in bringing him to the courts, and it sort of makes the appearance of things, and appearances, particularly in a world which is very appearance-oriented, is sort of important.
Two big differences. International law doesn't recognize the prohibition against hearsay or the exclusionary rule that would affect. Yeah, in our country, we have Supreme Court-made rules, exclusionary rule, keeping out a lot of evidence, and hearsay. You can't test. You can't admit evidence of what somebody else said, and international law doesn't recognize that. And military tribunals under international law thus would be able to admit more evidence.
That was the good thing about renditions, was that when they go to another country, let's say Egypt or Jordan, they don't have to give them the right to, you don't have a right to lawyer, you don't have a right to remain silent, and they have certain flexibility that we don't have. And we can prevent all kinds of questions that we want to get from them, and they'll provide us the answers.
But we do have an obligation under Common Article 3 that every detainee must be treated humanely.
Of course, yes.
We can't bypass that by outsourcing torture.
Yeah, I'm not in any way condoning torture, and from what I saw, at least when I was living in Jordan and working with the Jordanians, I didn't see torture there.
I just wanted to make this slightly more complicated. A couple of aspects. Because the Guantanamo debate publicly has become such a black and white kind of thing, which I think, in a general rule, that doesn't help one think about these things. Almost never in our domestic debate do we even raise the question, which you, sir, just raised, are these issues of criminal behavior, or is it a war? If these are POWs, you can hold them. I mean, that's the fundamental defense of it, but it doesn't get talked about much. There are a couple of complications. On the one hand, something like, I forget the last figures I saw, were something in the neighborhood of 10 or 15% of those who've been released have turned up back on the battlefield.
It's much higher than that.
It's not higher than that now.
Yeah, big recidivism.
The recidivism, I mean, the calculations, yeah, you're right, the last ones I saw were about 20, but over the years of releasing people, the calculations on recidivism have been going steadily upward. This is not a comforting feeling when you get into questions, because that is not a question which the court will address in a criminal conviction, is what happens if you release the person. We can't begin to put that into normal law, but it must be a vital one when you're talking about people who are planning. So on the one side, you've got some very good reasons for people holding people almost indefinitely. On the other side, we have the fact that there is an awful lot of sloppy procedure that has gone into the early phases of holding people in Guantanamo. I remember back in 83, early, or 82, I guess it was, we sent a Bahraini government delegation to talk to some of the Bahraini prisoners who were being held in Guantanamo. My then station chief accompanied them. Middle East specialist, Arabist, came back absolutely appalled by the quality of our intelligence and the incapacities of our analysts who were handling it, many of whom were not qualified, who did not understand distinctions between Arabic names, just all kinds of very, very basic stuff. So on the one hand, you have people genuinely mean us harm, that are evil, that we shouldn't be releasing, some of whom seem to be getting out. And then you have people swept up who appear to have very little connection to any real terrorism, held for years, and substantially messed about in a system where we've screwed it up to a fairly well. Untangling that mess on any grounds is going to be tough. And whatever conclusions you get to are going to be tough. I am, I doubt there is a right answer, or at least not in a perfectionist sense. I will say that I am impressed with where they have gotten to in the military commissions after, what is the second or third try at getting it right. And I have an enormous amount of respect for Mark Martins, who heads that process, who I knew in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who was really one of the brilliant rising officers on Petraeus' staff, and who resigned his commission when he was appointed to this job so that it could not be questioned whether he was doing anything for future promotion. That's pretty impressive, so I'm willing to let him handle it. But you really need to understand what I mean, everybody who discusses, I know you, needs to understand what a complex mess we have gotten ourselves into.
Okay, we're going to ask some other members, but I would like to make life a little bit more complicated.
I didn't do enough. Okay.
And just as a footnote to consider, even if the terrorists are going to be convicted, there is no guarantee that they're going to serve their sentence fully. In fact, even a country like Israel that has to face terrorism on a daily basis, they follow the practice to release terrorists with blood on their hands in exchange for one soldier, and so on. So one can debate some of the moral issues that countries have to take into account. Let me move on, and I would like to recognize right here Prince Ali, who served for many years to promote a dialogue between Afghanistan and the U.S. Would you get the mic here? Very briefly, because of the...
Yes, sir. Very quickly. Ambassador, nice to see you again, sir. I wish you had stayed in Afghanistan today. We would be talking differently, but you were removed too quickly from Afghanistan. My name is Abdul Ali Siraj. I'm a member of the former royal family of Afghanistan, and I've been involved in Afghanistan's affairs since April 27, 1978, so it's reaching almost 40 years. And for the past 40 years, I've been trying to make my adopted country, United States, and the officials within the U.S. government to understand, or to look at us through our eyes, not through the American eyes. Afghanistan is a nation of tribes, and as a nation of tribes, you have to understand the Afghan psyche. Each tribe has got its own psyche. You cannot compare the Pashtuns to the Tajiks, or Tajiks to Uzbeks, Uzbeks to Hazaras, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, they have come in there with one paintbrush and they want to paint all of us in the same color, which has not been working. Ambassador, you talked about allegiances, or you talked about the Islamic terrorists. These people do not have any belief in Islam. A Muslim does not wrap a suicide belt around himself to walk into a mosque on a Friday and kill dozens of Muslims and call Allahu Akbar. When he says Allahu Akbar, in essence, he's making Allah as his partner in the murder of other Muslims. Okay, so for them, there is no such a thing as Islam. These people follow the Wahhabi religion, as you indicated, Ms. Zeidman. The Wahhabi religion was created in 1763 by a man by the name of Abdul Wahhab, who in conjunction with Ibn Saud, with the help of the British, created Saudi Arabia. And Ibn Saud needed Wahhab's support to protect his region, so they have been trying to push the Wahhabi religion ever since. Wahhabi religion believes in two things: jihad, and to kill anybody that does not convert. It doesn't make any difference whether it's Sunnis, Shias, Christians, Yazidis, or whatever the case may be. Therefore, I'd like to make this understanding that the Muslims, Wahhabis has got nothing to do with true Muslims. The true Muslims are peaceful people, but we are ourselves, we are the victims of, tens of thousands of our people have been murdered. In Afghanistan, it's a nation of tribes. The tribes have always supported a strong leader. They have never rallied around a policy. They've always rallied around a strong leader. My family had the honor of defending Afghanistan in the 3 wars, in the 19th and 20th centuries of the 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, and we kept peace in Afghanistan. But once the central government was gone, the people did not have anybody to rally around. So they all rallied around their own strong men. The Uzbeks went around Dostum, the Tajiks went around Masood, and the Hazaras went around Khalili, and so on and so forth. The Pashtuns had nobody to go around. But the ISI of Pakistan, being the children of the British Empire, knew that the Pashtuns needed a leader. So they bring in Mullah Omar to Afghanistan. They take him to the mosque in Kandahar. They wrap the cape of Muhammad, peace be upon him, around his shoulders and give him the title of Amirul Mu'minin, which means the leader of Islam. Okay? And then the Pashtuns rallied around him because now they had somebody to go around. And because Mullah Omar was a stupid man, he lost at one eye fighting during the Soviet war, they could not leave him among the people, so they removed him and put him on a high tower, and they brought Osama bin Laden, who at that time was in Sudan, and he came into Afghanistan with a few thousand of Arab fighters and married into Mullah Omar's family, and they created the Taliban. The birthplace of Afghanistan is the Taliban. The father of the Taliban are Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan, who was being supported by Saudi Arabia. Let's put facts on the table where the facts are. My friends that are sitting over here, they have to understand the fact who's the godfather. To get rid of the bees, you must kill the queen bee. Once you kill the queen bee, get rid of the hive, then you get rid of all the bees. Today, we're running after the bees, but we're forgetting that the queen bee is sitting over there funding the movement. This movement is being funded by the Saudi money. It's being supported by Pakistan. Haqqani is in Pakistan. I know for a fact the Haqqani family live in mansions in Islamabad. The Kuwait Shura is in full operation. The Peshawar Shura is in full operation. Why aren't we doing anything against this? Why are we sacrificing young American lives? Billions of American dollars. 2,600 Americans massacred in Afghanistan over these last 16 years. The people of Afghanistan, the tribes of Afghanistan, are ready to fight shoulder to shoulder with their American brothers. But when the United States came into Afghanistan, the first thing they did was to bring British soldiers and put them in the place where we had defeated the British in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, where they lost an entire regiment. And the people from the tribal elders came to me and said, why are the Americans doing this to us? Why do they hate us? In any case, to make, I cannot, you give me, say, if you give me 15 hours, I may be able to tell you the 40 hours. But right now, what I'm saying is that we, Afghans, I, as the president of the National Coalition for Dialogue with Tribes of Afghanistan, I can line up tribal people to stand with their American brothers to fight the enemy. We know who the enemy is, you don't. We know where to go after them, you don't. We can do that, but you have to go to the people. By creating a government, by building a house, don't start building a roof on imaginary walls. The foundation of Afghanistan, our house, is our tribal people. The walls are the young generation. Once you build the foundation and the walls, then you can build the roof. But you have gone into building the roof on imaginary walls.
Thank you very much. We'll continue the dialogue, a special seminar on that, and we'll invite you, of course, to continue to contribute to discussion. Any member of the panel wants to respond, Mayor, on that? No? Okay. Any other question? We're running out of time. Any? Yes, please. Mr. Schweitzer, right there. Yes, use the mic.
Hi, my name is Glenn Schweitzer. Ambassador Newman made 2 points. One, it's going to be a long haul. And secondly, context is everything in how you deal with a problem in a specific country. I think the academic community is pretty well bought into those ideas, but there's a problem. Whenever there's an outbreak, the U.S. forgets those two things and sends in troops. And the troops immediately change the context. And now the context is the Americans must lead. So we're stuck. Now, you cited Tunisia as a good example of at least partial success story, and the Americans weren't there at all. Can you cite any other examples of success story? Can you cite an example of a success story where the Americans went in and aren't going to be there forever? Because they are now the context.
I don't think there's any place exactly like Tunisia where you have both thrown off an old order and created something new. You do have a number of places which have not exploded. Essentially, the 6 Arab regimes of the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia. That gets you in some questions about Saudi, but you've got actually quite a number of different regimes there. Most of them fairly benign as long as you don't really criticize them. But there's quite a difference between real monarchies and autocracies that are around one ruler. That's a much bigger question than I can handle in the time remaining on this panel. But on the whole, I am inclined not to destabilize things which have not exploded and which are not yet awful. There are ways to work for change, but we have a big problem when it comes to reform. Let me just give you one example. The tiny little country, Bahrain, happens to be one of which I know something. It's always better to talk about something where you know something. And we have postured it in our media as a conflict of people versus regime, because that fits our template of other exploding countries in the Middle East. It's basically inaccurate. It's a communal split between Sunni and Shia, with the monarchy indeed being Sunni, but it's much broader, deeper division of the society than simply people versus regime. You do have repression. You have a lot of other things going on as well. So when we tried to involve ourselves early on, we talked about the need for reform, but we put no definition or limit around that. So to the Bahraini monarchy, what's the difference between the reform we're talking about in Bahrain and the reform for President Mubarak, which is the end of the regime? Self-extinction is not an attractive policy to most leaders. So, on the one hand, we got no mileage with the Bahraini government by undifferentiated speaking of reform. Made us feel good. On the other hand, we never really got any place with the opposition, which kept thinking that because Americans are about democracy, if they would just press harder, we would give more. So we ended up being seriously disliked on both sides of the equation. Now that's the kind of thing where we're going to have to think it through. We might have been able to influence things a little bit early on. Now I think we're past that for a lot of reasons. But influencing it would have meant that we had to both combine an interest in reform for the long-term stability of the country with a definitional limit of reform. It doesn't really have to be democracy right now. Why on earth should it be one person, one vote democracy? If we'd gone for that, we'd have split the United States and not gotten the fundamental deal that produced our own Constitution, because the little states wouldn't have had it. So all I'm really saying is there are some other examples where things are possible or where things have not exploded, but we're going to have to deal with them in a much more complex, detailed fashion than bumper sticker slogans. And that's really all I can add to the question.
Okay. Any other? Yes, Ambassador Marks right there, the first row.
Thank you. I was struck by Professor Wallace's reference to the question of national priorities, raising that question. Another way to look at it is to look at the holy trinity of worldview, policy, and programs which determine how a country behaves. Contemporary political terrorism has been on our agenda and our screen for 50 or 60 years,
but there was a sea change at 9/11, and that was incorporated in the GWAT policy, which is based upon the concept that the terrorist threat, specifically the Islamist or Islamism terrorist threat, is an existential threat to the United States, to use that phrase. What if it isn't? What if it's a problem but not an existential threat? In which case, we have perverted our worldview, we have indulged in possibly policies which cannot be achieved, which have resulted in programs which cannot succeed, which are misdirected all over the world. So I suggest we possibly at this point, 16 years after this sea change in our policy, we take a look at this question of priorities, the question of what sort of level of threat this is to the United States. Or we may spend the next 17 years chasing Pushtu bandits around the foothills of the Hindu Kush.
Ed and I probably disagree on Afghanistan, but there are other pieces of this that I would agree with. I do not think the terrorism we face is an existential threat. I do believe that we are clearly designed to win in the long run, however long that run is, because I see absolutely no possibility that the jihadist view or the caliphate is actually going to overthrow the better part of the world. It may cause enormous destruction, and most of the people are killing are Muslims. Having said that, I think there is no possibility whatsoever that the United States is going to relax enough to allow you to just put this sort of on the back burner. I mean, I think the reality is that we will continue to muddle along, that people will gradually get used to living with this, but there's a psychological dimension you can't get rid of. We all have this. The threat we're not used to bothers us much more than the threat we are used to. You know, I used to tell people, look, because one of the biggest problems when you're dealing with this kind of stuff overseas, you all know, you've been there, is getting people to understand that a lot of situations are gray. They're not just safe or dangerous, but you can live in them if you are sensible. And so one of the problem was to get people to understand, look, there are threats you live with all your life because you're totally used to them. Try not checking your mirrors before you change lanes, or not looking left, right, left before you step off the curb. Major dangers, but you've totally programmed those things into your life, and so you don't treat them as dangers. Nobody thinks I'm not going to go to the supermarket because more Americans die in highway accidents than in any terrorist cause. Never stops anybody going to the supermarket. But it takes a long time to get to that level of living with threat. We're not there yet, so I don't think we will have the luxury of responding as perhaps we should, wipe out thousands of people in some kind of natural disasters. 3 months later, it's not a news story. Life goes on. Country rebuilds. I was listening to a report on the hurricane that hit Galveston in the early 1900s. Swept across the entire island, killed 6,000 people. Do you think we're not on Galveston today? So just getting these things into context just takes a long time.
Okay, Dr. Ira Strauss.
I'm going to have to leave in about 3
Last
minutes.
question.
Thank you. I'd like to join those who have praised the panel and to thank Dr. Alexander for putting together such an extraordinary, informative, and important panel for this tragic anniversary. It dignifies the day that we spend our time on this. I'd like to ask my question to Dr. Zeidman. I agree with those who said that yours is the most extraordinary of a set of extraordinary presentations. And I'd like to ask, in a sense, why? It seems to me your presentation should be absolutely ordinary. You gave a comprehensive overview of what the problem is, what our mistakes have been in dealing with it, and pinpoint accuracy in stating those mistakes. That should be normal briefing procedure. And yet I found it extraordinary, possibly the best statement I've heard on this subject since 9/11 all those years ago. Why is that? And why do I feel a bit afraid in front of the vast external world, not here, but in front of the vast external world, that you and those who praise you might get accused of things like Islamophobia or calling all Muslims terrorists or declaring war on all of Islam, which are just absurd accusations, almost invariably ill-directed, occasionally justified, but certainly not in most cases. Does this have something to do with why presentations like yours are so rare? How does this affect us in defining the issues, in learning from our mistakes, and in formulating intelligent policies?
Well, unfortunately, politics gets involved in decision-making, and political correctness gets involved. There's a lot of factors, but you're right that there is a risk in being branded as an Islamophobe. And I like to remind people that what we're talking about is not Muslims, we're talking about Islamic extremism. We're talking about a small percentage of Muslims, but there's so many Muslims in the world that even a small percentage, like the ambassador mentioned, can present a problem. Let me quote Abdul Rahman al-Awsat, the general manager of Al Arabiya Cable Network. He was quoted in Sharq al-Assad newspaper. He said, "It is a certain fact that not all Muslims are terrorists, but it is equally certain and exceptionally painful that almost all terrorists are Muslims." And there are, with just a few exceptions, like Oklahoma City bombing, the Yona bomber, the vast majority of the terrorist incidents that we've been experiencing worldwide are from Islamic extremists. Not all Muslims, but the Islamic extremists. Does that answer your question?
The question was more, why is this absurd accusation made against you? And how does that affect our ability to define the issues intelligently and respond to them intelligently?
Well, I think I would attribute it to political correctness. I mean, basically, when you're winning an argument, your opponent's going to say, you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're an Islamophobe, you're a homophobe. There's always something. So, I mean, when you don't have facts to counter an argument, you go to smearing.
Anyone else?
I've got some deep regret. But
Yeah, I know. Okay, General Gray, please.
Thank you, Yona. As usual, we're already out of time. So I have a choice of either getting everybody angry with me or turning them loose. I do want to thank this panel. I agree with many of the speakers who said that it's been extraordinary. And it's obvious that there's been a lot of talk about our strategy and our shortcomings and this and that. And maybe it would be useful to go back and look at a few of the basics with respect to our nation and how we really have organized and taught ourselves to do business and to conduct relations over the years. First of all, any strategy has to take into account all the elements of national power, not just military, but the political aspects, the economic aspects, the societal aspects, etc. And so it has to be a joint, unified type of effort. You've heard many good points from all of our speakers, but they have to all be blended together, and they have to be thought about and they have to be weighed. Any strategy starts with defining an end state. You've got to decide what you want it to look like 10 or 15 years from now, because that's your overall goal. And in this case, our strategy has to be extraordinarily adaptive. It has to be adapted by region. It has to be, as has been pointed out, by country. It has to be a strategy that clearly understands history. We need to go back to about 1200 or so AD and begin to look at the history of how this all came about and what happened after Genghis Khan and his Mongols had their campaign and the impact that this had on the Muslim idea, etc. And then you have to work on down, particularly to the early 1900s and the latter part of the 1800s when the Wahhabi business started, and who designed that, and what happened when the people in Egypt began to get involved, and so on. So it's a very complicated type of thought process here, and I guess we would sum it up by saying you need to know your enemy. You need to know these things. You need to understand it. You need to know about the cultures, the mores, the languages, etc. Terrorism is not, you can't have a war, terrorism is a tactic. And you can't have a war against a tactic. So that whole idea ought to be relooked at again. We need to learn how to use strategic information, as has been pointed out. We haven't been able to do that since we did away with the information agency and all that kind of thing. We need to have an understanding, and the role of the media has to be clearly understood, and it has to be, to some extent, regulated or thought about, because we're playing right in the hands of these terrorist type activities by advertising everything they do, by talking about it all the time instead of being quiet about it. Bring it up and then let's be quiet about it. And we can whack them when we want to whack them at the right time. We don't have to go into a country and to combat terrorism and that kind of thing all the time. There are a lot of ways of doing this. What about following the money? We have to look at that too, and how that money weighs into it. So there are many, many considerations, far more than we've had time to talk about here today. But certainly this panel has ignited our information. Again, I want to thank you all, and for all of you, thank you for being with us.
Hey, Wayne.